Hello everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into an emotional story where love faces its hardest test, when choosing the truth means letting go of the person you love most. In Diep's arms, James finally opens up, and one painful decision changes everything. If you find this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The evening came down slowly, almost hesitantly. Soft golden light rested on the bamboo roof, slipping through the gaps and spreading across the small kitchen. The space was simple, quiet, and warm. Diep stood by the stove, calmly stirring a pan of vegetables. Oil sizzled gently, firewood crackled underneath, and the familiar sounds filled the room like a quiet heartbeat. James sat across from her. He was unusually still, so still that even his breathing felt too loud in the silence. His eyes stayed on Diep the entire time, following every small movement of her hands, every shift of her shoulders. It felt like he was afraid that if he blinked, this fragile moment of peace would break apart. "Are you very tired?" James finally asked, his voice low, careful, almost afraid to disturb the calm. Diep paused for a brief second, but didn't turn around. "Life out there has already worn you down enough," she said gently. "Now that you're home, just rest." Her words were soft, but they landed heavily in his chest. James clenched his hands together. He had practiced what he wanted to say over and over on the way back: apologies, explanations, regret. But now that the moment was here, all of it felt stuck somewhere deep inside him. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "That day, I said things I shouldn't have. I raised my voice. I lost control of my emotions." Diep slowly set the pan aside and turned to face him. There was no anger in her eyes, no accusation, only a quiet sadness that seemed far heavier than shouting ever could be. "Let's eat," she said calmly. "Food doesn't taste good when it gets cold." They sat down. Dinner passed with very few words. The clinking of chopsticks and bowls filled the gaps between their silence. James ate quickly, like someone who hadn't had a real meal in a long time. "It's really good," he said, forcing a small smile. "I honestly can't remember the last time I ate something this comforting." Diep reached over and added more rice to his bowl. "Eat more." That simple gesture hit him harder than any argument ever had. After everything that had happened, after all the distance and pain, she was still taking care of him in the same quiet way. Later, they sat with cups of hot coffee. Steam rose slowly into the air. The warmth filled the room and seemed to loosen something inside James, memories he had kept buried for far too long. "Where are you staying now?" Diep asked. "I asked Ms. Hyen, but she said you weren't home." James stared into his cup for a long moment. Then he let out a slow breath, as if he had finally made up his mind. "I won't hide anything from you anymore." His voice dropped lower. "When I went abroad to look for Hung, I spent days searching. I finally found him, but something had already happened. I took care of what I could for him, arranged things properly. I just didn't tell my father." Diep's hands tightened around the cup. "When I decided to come back to Vietnam," James continued, "someone stopped me. They took my documents. They blocked every possible way I had to return." He looked up at her, his eyes red and tired. "Later, I found out. It was my father." The air in the room felt suddenly heavy, almost frozen. "I eventually found a way to escape and come back," James said quietly. "That's everything. That's the truth." Diep swallowed hard. "And during that time, how did you live?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her. "And you?" he asked. How did you live while I wasn't here?" Diep gave a faint smile, but it never reached her eyes. "I kept working. I didn't allow myself to rest. Lynn helped a lot with the business, so things are okay." She paused, her voice softening. "But life without you felt empty. Nye misses you so much. Every time your name comes up, she cries." James lowered his head, shame and regret weighing him down. "I never wanted things to turn out like this. I just wanted a peaceful life. With you, with Nye, with our family." Diep's voice trembled slightly. "You came back without telling me. Do you know how worried I was?" James nodded slowly. "I do. And you were right to be angry. I'm sorry." Silence stretched between them again. Then James said the words he had been avoiding since the moment he returned. "I'm gathering evidence." Diep looked up immediately. "Evidence? For what?" "To confront my father." Her face lost its color. "You mean to put him in jail?" James didn't respond right away. "No matter what he's done," Diep said urgently, "he's still your father. You can't do that." "If I don't," James replied bitterly, "then I have to obey him. I have to go abroad again, and I have to leave you." Diep felt her chest tighten. "I know I'm poor," she said quietly. "I try every day to be worthy of you, but he still doesn't agree." James reached for her hand. "It's not because of that." "I think it is," Diep said softly. "Your family is wealthy. You're talented. The woman standing beside you has to match that." James shook his head, but the doubt in his eyes gave him away. "Then tell me," he asked, his voice strained, "if I don't do this, is there any way for us to stay together?" Diep didn't answer right away. She stayed silent for a long time, staring at the floor as if weighing every possible outcome. "I don't want our love to destroy your family," she finally said. "No one should intentionally tear their own family apart." James's voice cracked. "Then what should I do?" Diep took a deep breath, gathering what little strength she had left. "If loving me means you have to hurt your own father," she said quietly, "then that love isn't worth it." James froze. "Then maybe we should stop." The words fell between them like a blade. "What?" James stood up suddenly. "What are you saying?" "I'm an orphan," Diep said, tears streaming down her face. "I know how painful it is to lose a family. I don't want you to live the rest of your life trapped in regret." "I don't want to stop," James said desperately. "I don't want to either," Diep cried. "But I can't let you do this because of me." She turned away. "I'll take Nye's clothes and go." James followed her to the door. "Open it! Please," Diep sobbed. "Don't hurt your father. For me!" The door closed. Time passed quietly. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just one ordinary day after another, slipping by without announcement. Life didn't collapse after that night. It didn't explode either. It simply went on, as if nothing had changed. And somehow, that hurt even more. The small house returned to its familiar rhythm. Diep woke up early, cooked meals, went to work, and came home before sunset. She fed the chickens, washed clothes, and tidied the yard like she always had. From the outside, everything looked the same. But inside, something was missing. Every familiar corner of the house reminded her of James. The empty chair across the table, the quiet evenings that felt longer than they used to. Even the sound of the wind brushing through the bamboo walls felt different now, hollower. Nye stayed by her side most of the time. The little girl played in the yard, humming to herself, dragging toys through the dirt. Her laughter echoed through the small space, light and innocent, completely unaware of the heaviness in Diep's heart. "Ms. Diep?" Nye asked one afternoon, looking up with wide eyes. "Why didn't Uncle James come today?" Diep froze for a split second. She crouched down, smoothing Nye's hair, forcing a gentle smile onto her face. "He's busy with work," she said softly. "When he's free, I'll ask him to come play with you." Nye nodded, satisfied with the answer. "Okay." She ran off again, her laughter filling the yard. Diep turned away. Only then did the tears fall, silent, restrained, slipping down her face without a sound. She wiped them quickly, afraid that even the walls might notice. At night, when the house grew quiet, the memories came back the strongest. James sitting across from her at the table, James drinking coffee, listening without interrupting, James watching her cook, like that simple act alone was enough to bring him peace. She wondered where he was sleeping now, if he was eating properly, if he was still searching for answers, or just feeling lost. Across town, James sat alone in a small rented room. The space was barely furnished. A narrow bed, a desk, a single window that let in just enough light to remind him of the time passing. He lay awake most nights, staring at the ceiling, replaying Diep's words over and over again. If loving me means you have to hurt your own father, then that love isn't worth it. No matter how many times he replayed that moment, the pain never dulled. He had thought that choosing love would give him clarity. Instead, it had left him standing in the middle of everything, with no direction that didn't hurt someone. His father's expectations pressed down on him like a weight. His sense of responsibility pulled him in another direction. And Diep? Diep had chosen to step away, not because she loved him less, but because she loved him too much. That was the part he couldn't forgive himself for. Days later, James stood outside Diep's house. He didn't knock. He just stood there, watching from a distance as she moved around the yard, watching Nye chase a chicken, laughing when it ran away, watching Diep scold her gently, her voice soft and warm. This was the life he wanted. Simple, quiet, real. And it was the very life he had brought pain into. James turned away before anyone noticed him. Back inside the house, Diep felt it. That strange feeling, like someone had been there, like something familiar had brushed past and vanished before she could hold on to it. She paused, looking toward the gate, but there was no one there. She sighed and went back to her work. That night, Nye asked again, "Ms. Diep, Uncle James said he'd take me to see the big Christmas tree. When will we go?" Diep's hands trembled slightly as she folded the clothes. "Let me ask him first," she said carefully. "If he's free, we'll go together." Nye smiled brightly. "Okay." After Nye fell asleep, Diep sat alone in the dark. She thought about calling James. She thought about asking how he was doing. She thought about telling him she missed him, but she didn't, because she knew one phone call could undo all the strength she had barely managed to hold on to. James, meanwhile, stood at his own crossroads. The evidence was there. The truth was clear. If he moved forward, he could expose everything. But every step closer to that path pulled him further away from the people he loved. Was justice worth the cost of becoming someone who destroyed his own family? Was love worth surviving on regret? He remembered Diep's eyes when she said she was an orphan, the way her voice broke when she begged him not to hurt his father, the way she chose pain for herself just to keep him from carrying it. That was when James finally understood. Some battles aren't meant to be won. Some choices aren't about right or wrong, but about what kind of person you choose to be afterward. Days turned into weeks. James stopped gathering evidence. He didn't confront his father. He didn't leave the country. He didn't go back to Diep either. Instead, he stayed where he was, working, enduring, carrying the consequences of every choice he hadn't made. Diep noticed the silence, too. No messages, no sudden appearances, no promises that couldn't be kept. It hurt, but it also told her something important. James was listening. One afternoon, Ms. Huyen came by with Nhi. "She keeps talking about James," she said gently. "I thought you should know." Diep nodded, forcing a smile. "I know." As they watched Nhi play, Ms. Huyen spoke quietly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Diep didn't answer, because deep down, she knew that love didn't always reward the people who chose it the hardest way. That night, Diep stood by the stove again. The same pan, the same firewood, the same familiar sounds. But this time, there was only one bowl on the table. She stirred the vegetables slowly, lost in thought. Somewhere out there, James was living his life without her, and she was living hers without him. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because sometimes love isn't about staying. Sometimes love is about stepping away. So the people you care about don't lose themselves in the process. Diep turned off the stove. Outside, the evening fell once more, slowly, quietly. And somewhere between regret and acceptance, two people continued living, forever connected by a love that chose sacrifice over happiness. Because some loves don't end when feelings fade. They end when loving deeply means letting go. James returns to Diep after a long absence, and in a quiet evening filled with unspoken emotions, he finally reveals the truth behind his disappearance. He confesses that his journey abroad to find Hung led to conflict with his own father, who deliberately prevented him from returning home. While Diep shares how she struggled to work, care for Nhi, and endure loneliness, their love is tested by a painful choice. James wants to confront his father using evidence, but Diep refuses to let their relationship destroy his family. As an orphan, she understands the pain of losing family too deeply. Despite loving James with all her heart, Diep chooses to step away, believing that love should not be built on regret or broken bonds. In the end, their story becomes one of sacrifice, where true love means letting go rather than holding on.